Hello and welcome to our channel, where the shadows of history come to life, and the truth is more chilling than fiction. Today, we delve into the story of one of the most terrifying serial killers the UK has ever known, Dennis Nilsen, the man who turned his quiet London flat into a house of horror. If you enjoy true crime stories, mysteries, and the darkest corners of human psychology, then you've come to the right place. Before we begin this unsettling tale, don't forget to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and hit the notification bell so you won't miss any of our deep dives into the world of real-life horror. Are you ready to step into the mind of a monster? Let's begin. In the grim, rain-soaked streets of 1970s London, where fog coiled like a serpent around weary buildings, an unassuming man named Dennis Nilsen lived a life that masked unspeakable horrors. By day, he was the quiet civil servant, a friendly colleague who appeared polite, ordinary, even dull. But in the dead of night, in the dim confines of his small flat, Nilsen harbored the darkest of urges. A monster stirred within him, born not of any sudden fury, but a slow, calculated transformation that began long before his first kill. To those who knew him superficially, he was Des, just another face in a crowd, a man who enjoyed drinks at the local pub, the company of his dog, and simple meals. No one could imagine that beneath his unremarkable facade, Des was hiding death. Corpses lay beneath floorboards. Limbs burned in fireplaces. The quiet man was anything but ordinary. Dennis Andrew Nilsen was born on November 23, 1945, in Fraserburgh, a small coastal town in Scotland. His childhood was marked by dysfunction and loneliness. His parents, Betty and Olav, had a troubled marriage, and by the time Dennis was 4 years old, his father had disappeared from his life altogether. The absence left a scar that would fester for decades. It was during these formative years that Nilsen formed a strange attachment to his grandfather, his only source of warmth. A fisherman, his grandfather was Dennis's hero. He adored him, but tragedy struck on a cold October day in 1951 when his beloved grandfather passed away unexpectedly. Dennis, only 6 years old, was devastated. The final memory of his grandfather haunted him for life, a small, pale body lying lifeless in a coffin. Death, for the first time, had revealed itself to the young boy, and rather than recoil in fear, Dennis felt a strange and quiet fascination. It planted a seed, a macabre lure to the stillness and control of death. His adolescence was a period of quiet confusion. Dennis realized he was attracted to men, but in 1950s Scotland, such feelings were taboo. He withdrew further into himself, hiding his sexuality, ashamed and confused. To cope with the isolation, Dennis would daydream, imagining men lying motionless at his side. Love, he believed, was inseparable from death. Years later, he would say, "I wanted to possess the beauty of others, to keep them forever." After finishing school, Nilsen briefly served in the British Army, training as a cook. His time in the military taught him discipline but also further distanced him from others. He spent years traveling to Germany, Yemen, and beyond. While soldiers around him forged bonds, Dennis remained detached, cultivating fantasies of control and possession. By the early 1970s, Nilsen settled in London, working as a civil servant. He lived alone in a small flat and spent his free time frequenting pubs where he could meet young men, runaways, drifters, or men down on their luck. These encounters began innocently enough, a drink, a friendly chat, a shared room for the night. But loneliness gnawed at Dennis like a ravenous beast. Soon, his desires turned dark. On December 30, 1978, Dennis Nilsen crossed a line that could never be uncrossed. The first victim, Stephen Holmes. That cold winter night, Nilsen met a 14-year-old boy named Stephen Holmes in a pub. The boy had snuck into the bar, and Nilsen invited him home, promising drinks and a place to stay. They drank together, and Stephen fell asleep. As Dennis watched the sleeping boy, an overpowering thought gripped him: if I let him leave, I will be alone again. Something in him snapped. He strangled Stephen with a necktie and then drowned him in a bucket of water. When the life drained from Stephen's body, Dennis felt an odd sense of peace. Here was someone who would never leave him. He bathed the body, dressed it, and laid it in bed beside him. For days, Stephen's corpse remained in the flat as Dennis relished the company. Eventually, he hid the body beneath the floorboards. The cycle of death. The first murder opened a door Dennis Nilsen could no longer close. Over the next 5 years, he killed at least 15 young men in similar fashion. His victims were often vulnerable, homeless youths, addicts, or sex workers. They were easy prey, and Nilsen lured them in with kindness, food, shelter, and alcohol. Once they were in his flat, the ritual began. He would strangle them, sometimes drowning them afterward. When the bodies went limp, Nilsen would wash them, dress them, and sit beside them. Some nights, he spoke to them as if they were still alive. Other nights, he propped them up in chairs, watching television with his silent companions. To dispose of the bodies, Nilsen became creative. In his first flat at 195 Melrose Avenue, he hid them under the floorboards. When the stench of decay became overwhelming, he would dismember the corpses and burn the remains in his garden, disguising the fire with tires to mask the smell. By 1981, Nilsen moved to a new flat at 23 Cranley Gardens. Without floorboards to hide bodies, his methods grew sloppier. He began dismembering victims immediately and flushing body parts down the toilet. It was this carelessness that led to his capture. In February 1983, neighbors complained about blocked drains. When a plumber arrived, he discovered chunks of flesh and bone clogging the pipes. The police were called, and Nilsen's horrific secret was uncovered. When officers knocked on his door, Nilsen calmly confessed, "It's a long story. I'll tell you everything." Dennis Nilsen was not driven by rage or sadism. His crimes were rooted in loneliness and a pathological need for control. Psychologists later diagnosed him with narcissistic personality disorder, noting his obsession with possession and death. To Nilsen, killing was his twisted solution to abandonment. By keeping his victims' bodies, he felt they could never leave him. He once chillingly remarked, "I killed them because I loved them." At trial, Nilsen was convicted of 6 counts of murder and 2 counts of attempted murder, though the true number of victims remains unknown. On November 4, 1983, he was sentenced to life imprisonment. In prison, Nilsen showed little remorse. He spent his time writing autobiographies and analyzing his crimes with eerie detachment. Dennis Nilsen died on May 12, 2018, at the age of 72. Even in death, he remained an enigma, a man whose loneliness turned him into a predator. The story of Dennis Nilsen is one of horror, tragedy, and psychological dissection. His crimes were not driven by bloodlust but by a profound and dangerous loneliness. He was a monster of his own making, a man whose desires consumed him and those he lured into his shadowed world. To this day, the legacy of his crimes chills the bones of all who hear his name. Thank you for joining us on this deep dive into one of the darkest chapters of true crime history. Dennis Nilsen's story is a chilling reminder that evil often hides in plain sight. If you found this video engaging or learned something new, please don't forget to like the video and subscribe to the channel. Your support helps us create more stories about the mysteries and horrors of the real world. And if you have thoughts or questions about this case, share them in the comments below. I'd love to hear what you think. Until next time, stay curious, stay safe, and we will see you in the next video.